It began on the night the sky forgot its stars, and the earth began to hum beneath his feet, a low trembling whispering through the soil, like a secret finally too heavy to keep. And as you listen to this, somewhere in the quiet corners of your own life, you know there are secrets pressing against the edges of your understanding too, waiting for a crack in your certainty to slip through and touch you where belief and fear share the same fragile room. In a world where most people scroll past miracles without even recognizing them, there are still a few who look up at the sky and feel that strange ache, that question that won't go away. And if this story finds you tonight, it is not by accident, because this community was born for those who have felt the invisible hand on their shoulder and wondered if anyone else had ever seen what they saw, felt what they felt, and longed for a place where their questions were not mocked, but welcomed, like tired travelers finally coming home. On the outskirts of a small Midwestern town, where the fields rolled out like old green prayers and the roads remembered every truck that ever rattled down them, lived a man named Daniel Reeves, a farmer by trade and a mechanic by necessity, the kind of man whose hands knew more about broken things than most people ever would. His days were measured in sunrises, diesel fumes, and the rhythm of seasons, and though his neighbors saw him as steady, simple, dependable, Daniel carried a quiet emptiness that clung to him the way dust settled on his boots at the end of each long day, fine and invisible but heavy all the same. His wife, Claire, had gone 3 winters earlier, taken by an illness that moved faster than hope could run, and since then, the farmhouse had become a museum of small ghosts, a place where coffee cups sat where she had left them, and her Bible lay open on the kitchen table, underlined verses fading in the same slow, patient way his faith had. He still bowed his head before meals, but the words no longer seemed to rise, and when the pastor spoke on Sundays about heaven and purpose and plans, Daniel listened the way a distant man listens to a language he once knew but could no longer speak, recognizing shapes without understanding the meaning. The town around him was stitched together by old steeples, rusted trucks, and weather-beaten faces, and though the people there kept their Bibles close and their stories of God even closer, many of them carried doubts they buried. Under jokes, work, and long drives down empty highways where no one could hear them talk to the night, Daniel's doubts were not loud, not dramatic, not angry. They were like low clouds that never quite cleared, a drizzle of questions that never turned into a storm, but never allowed the sun to fully break through either, leaving his soul in a kind of permanent overcast. He had once believed in angels, in miracles, in the kind of God who spoke through whispers and coincidences, but the day he watched Claire's chest rise and fall for the last time, something in him had shut a door so quietly he barely noticed it had closed. Life after that became a sequence of motions, checking the fences, feeding the cattle, fixing engines in a dimly lit shed that smelled of oil and old metal, driving into town for parts, while the radio murmured sermons and country songs that blended together into a single unremarkable noise in the background. At night, when the work was done and silence lay over the gee, fields like a second layer of snow, Daniel would sit on the back porch with a mug of black coffee and stare at the sky, not to pray, not to seek, but simply because the stars were the only thing left that had not changed, a cold, distant reminder that the universe kept moving whether he understood it or not. The townsfolk knew him as the man who would help them jump a truck on a January morning, who would lend a tool without asking questions, who would show up at a neighbor's funeral with a covered dish and a firm handshake, and in many ways he was content to be that man, defined by utility rather than mystery. But under the surface of his routine, something inside him had begun to itch, a restlessness he did not have words for, a sense that the world was not as flat and predictable as his days suggested, that somewhere beyond his fences and his fields, a story much larger than his own was unfolding. And somehow, impossibly, it was waiting for him. The first sign came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday night in late autumn, when the corn had been cut down to brittle stubble, and the air carried that thin chill that made breath visible and memories sharper. The town had gone quiet by 9, as it always did, porch lights winking out one by one, as if the houses themselves were closing their eyes. and the only sounds on Daniel's land were the ticking of cooling metal from his old pickup and the faint rustle of dry weeds along the fence line. He had just settled onto the porch steps, coffee in hand, when the wind died so suddenly it felt as if someone had pressed a finger to the lips of the world, shushing everything at once, and in that unnatural stillness his heart gave a small, involuntary stutter. There is a kind of silence in rural places that feels natural, the soft quiet that settles after a day of work, filled with distant owls and the murmur of insects. But this was not that silence. This was the absence of everything, a vacuum where even the crickets seemed to hold their breath, and the hairs on Daniel's arms rose beneath his worn jacket. He set his mug down slowly, listening, telling himself it was nothing, just a lull, a trick of the night. But then the earth beneath the porch began to hum, a low, steady vibration that he felt more than heard, pulsing up through the wood into his bones like the echo of some buried chorus. His first thought was practical, as always. An engine, maybe, some distant train, a generator coming online, but the farm was alone for miles, and this hum was not mechanical. It was organic, resonant, as if the soil itself had become a throat and was trying for the first time in history to form a word. He stood, his boots creaking softly on the boards, and looked out over the dark fields, expecting to see headlights or distant machinery, some reasonable explanation. But the land was drowned in shadow, the only visible forms the jagged silhouettes of fence posts and the skeletal remains of harvested rows. Then he saw the stars disappear one by one, like candles snuffed by an invisible hand. The familiar constellations winked out, not blinked, not hidden by clouds, but erased, the ink of the sky swallowing them until only a vast, depthless black remained above him. And in that black something began to form. It was not a ship in the way movies imagined them, no sharp edges or metallic gleam. It was more like a bruise spreading across the heavens, a dense darkness within darkness, and from its center, a single point of light ignited, small and faint at first, like a star being born in fast forward. The humming in the earth intensified, but it was no longer frightening, at least not in the ordinary sense. It felt strangely familiar, like the deep reverberation of a church organ filling the bones during a hymn, or the vibration in the chest when standing too close to a passing freight train, power made into a physical sensation. The point of light grew, stretching downward in a slender column that seemed to ignore distance, folding the sky toward the ground until it touched the far edge of Daniel's field, with a sound that was not a sound at all but a shift, a rearranging of everything, like a book snapping shut on a chapter no one knew had ended. There was no explosion, no blinding flash, just a gentle widening of that light at ground level, as if someone had opened a door in the dark and left the hallway shining beyond it, and Daniel realized with a slow, dawning terror and awe that the light was not simply in his field, it was entering his life, crossing a boundary he had never known was there. He should have run, he thought later, should have gone back inside, locked the door, called someone, done anything except stand there, rooted to the spot. But in that moment his body refused to obey the rules of fear, held fast by a presence that felt older than time, and yet oddly gentle, like a hand on his shoulder that knew his name. The light did not move toward him in a straight line. It pulsed, breathing, expanding and contracting in slow waves, each pulse sending a faint warmth across the field that kissed his face and filled his lungs with air that tasted like rain on dry dust, like the first breath after a long cry. As it drew closer, he saw that it was not uniform. Within the column swam colors he had no words for, hues that seemed to exist between the ones he knew, shifting like the inside of an opal held to the sun. And within those colors, shapes flickered, patterns that felt almost like language trying to remember itself. His mind, trained over years to think in nuts and bolts, seeds and seasons, tried to catalogue, to analyze, to label what he was seeing: weather phenomenon, atmospheric anomaly, hallucination. But each attempt fell away as the experience outgrew the words he had. When the front edge of the light reached the fence line, it did something that made his breath catch. It parted neatly around each wooden post, flowing past them without burning, without bending. The grass, as if respecting their presence, acknowledging the boundary they represented without being confined by it. That small courtesy, that impossible gentleness, broke something in him, because it felt intentional, like a guest wiping their boots before stepping into a home. And in that moment, the fear that had gripped his spine loosened, replaced by a trembling curiosity that felt disturbingly like hope. The column finally came to rest 20 yards from his porch, no further, settling into a steady, luminous pillar that bathed the yard in soft radiance but cast no harsh shadows, as though the light came from everywhere and nowhere at once, erasing the angles and leaving only outlines of things, as if the world were being redrawn in pencil. Daniel realized he could hear something now, not with his ears but with whatever part of a person listens when they stop rehearsing their doubts long enough to hear what lies beneath them. It was a vibration inside his chest, a low, resonant tone. That harmonized with the hum in the earth, and he felt suddenly, inexplicably, that the two sounds were calling to each other through him. Within the standing light, a shape emerged, not stepping out so much as condensing, like a figure slowly born from fog, edges sharpening until a form stood where moments before there had been nothing but glow. It was tall, taller than any man Daniel had ever met, but not towering in a way that threatened. Instead, its height carried a kind of solemn dignity, like the steeple of the old town church or the grain silos that watched over the fields, familiar symbols of things that stood between earth and sky. Its body seemed woven from the same light that surrounded it, not flesh, but something that suggested form without insisting on it, as if at any moment it could dissolve back into pure radiance and leave no trace behind. Where a face should have been, there was no mouth, no nose, only a smooth plane of shifting luminosity. But at the place where eyes might belong, two deeper wells of light formed, not brighter but more focused, and when they turned toward him he felt a sense of being seen that stripped him down past skin, past history, all the way to the quiet, trembling center of who he was. He expected to hear a voice, something booming or otherworldly or at least distinct, but there were no words in the usual sense. Instead, the tone in his chest rose, meeting another tone emanating from the being, their resonance colliding somewhere between them. And with that collision came meaning. It did not speak, it understood, and in its understanding he heard something like language, not in his ears but in his thoughts, sliding into the gaps left behind by his questions, filling them with impressions that felt truer than any sentence ever had. The first impression was simple and overwhelming all at once. Welcome. The word itself did not appear inside him, but the feeling of it did. The memory of his wife opening the door on cold nights, the warmth of a church foyer after trudging through snow, the quiet relief of someone waving from a distance when he thought he was alone, all braided together and directed toward him from this towering presence. Alongside that welcome came something else, something that made his knees weaken and his breath hitch. The being knew him, not in the surface way neighbors knew him, as the man who knew how to fix carburetors and could be counted on to show up when a storm took down a tree, but in the way. Only a handful of people in his life ever had, knowing the stories behind his silences, the prayers he used to say but no longer dared to, the way he still touched the empty side of the bed some mornings, as if making sure the absence was still there. In that knowing there was no accusation, no scolding, only a deep, unshakable understanding, and in the face of it the defenses he had built around his grief, sarcasm, busyness, a polite distance from God, felt as flimsy as spiderwebs in a storm. He wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, to demand explanations, but his tongue felt heavy, unnecessary, because every question he formed seemed to unravel and dissolve in the presence of a knowledge that ran deeper than language. Instead, he thought, not on purpose, not as a test, but because the thought rose unbidden from the place where he kept his oldest hurt, "Are you here for me, or are you here to take something else away?" The being responded, not with an answer, but with an image projected, not before his eyes but within his mind's horizon, a wheat field, golden and endless, under a sky split by brilliant light, and in that field storks bowed not in terror, but in recognition, as if the light was something they had been grown to meet. Alongside the image came a sense of timing, of sequence, of a story written before soil ever touched seed, and Daniel realized with a slow, shaking awareness that whatever this was, it did not belong to the small, paranoid narratives of abductions and invasions he had heard around diner tables and late-night radio. This was not conquest, this was revelation. Somewhere in the back of his memory, a verse stirred, something from Claire's Bible, words about trumpets and clouds, and a voice calling the dead and the living. And for the first time in years, the image of Jesus did not feel like an old painting on a church wall, but like a presence threaded through this impossible moment, not replaced by it. The light being's resonance shifted, introducing a new tone, a higher, clearer frequency that made his eyes sting with sudden tears, and with it came the unmistakable impression of a name, not the name of the being, but a name spoken through it, a name he had heard 1,000 times, and yet never like this. Jesus. It was not an argument, not proof, not doctrine. It was a recognition, like seeing the silhouette of a loved one standing in a doorway after a long absence, their outline familiar, even if the details are still hidden by shadow. The being did not claim to be Jesus, did not pretend to replace him. Instead, the impression he received was that this presence was a witness, a messenger from a place where the veil between the seen and the unseen was thinner, where what humans called spiritual and what they called cosmic were simply different angles on the same unbroken reality. The universe, the being seemed to say without speaking, was not a cold, empty expanse dotted with accidental lights, but a vast, living temple, and every star was a candle in a sanctuary, far larger than any cathedral human hands had ever built. Daniel saw swirling galaxies as if from above, their spirals like fingerprints, like worlds pressed into existence by a hand that delighted in patterns, and through those spirals ran threads of something he recognized not from science, but from the simple, aching longing in his own chest. Love. It was there, holding atoms together, stretching across light years, humming in the spaces between electrons, the same love he had once felt in Claire's hand when she clung to him during late-night storms, the same love that had once made him believe the words sung in small churches with off-key voices could reach all the way to heaven. The being showed him, in a way that bypassed his skepticism entirely, that what humans called heaven and what they called the cosmos were not different locations, but different languages for the same mystery, and that the one they knew as Christ was not confined to stained glass, windows, or the imaginations of the devout, but moved through the very fabric of reality. Like a melody weaving through a song, Daniel wanted to sink to his knees, to bow, to do something. But his body remained upright, as if the being itself held him gently in place, asking him not to worship it but to listen through it. That thought unsettled him because it implied a hierarchy he did not understand. If this was not God, not Jesus, then what was it? And how could something so powerful, so impossibly beyond him, still speak of someone greater? The resonance shifted again, this time carrying a weight that felt like sorrow and hope braided tightly together, and with it came images that were less beautiful and far more terrifying. He saw the earth, not from space but from above its history, watching empires rise and fall like waves, each convinced it would be the last, each leaving behind ruins and songs and stories of why it had mattered. He saw wars flaring across maps, lines drawn, and redrawn until the land itself seemed to bleed, and he felt the grief of countless lives cut short, their names lost except to the one who counted every breath. He saw cathedrals and tents and simple wooden chapels, all filled with people reaching toward something they could not see. Some with open hands, some with clenched fists, some with hearts so bruised they barely believed anything could answer them at all. Through it all, through centuries of confusion and corruption and sincere devotion, one figure kept appearing, not in thrones or crowns, but in the quiet corners, the sickbeds, the prison cells, the lonely barns and hospital rooms where people whispered his name like a last hope. And in each image, the same eyes met theirs with the same patient, burning kindness. Jesus was not a doctrine in these visions. He was a presence, and every time someone called, he answered, not always with the miracle they wanted, but with a strange, fierce nearness that refused to abandon them. The being let that reality sink into Daniel before layering another thread over it. This one more urgent, more immediate, like the tightening of a drum before a long-anticipated song. He saw a horizon, not of land, but of time, approaching faster than anyone realized, and along that horizon, lights were gathering, countless points converging in a sweeping arc that curved toward the earth like a great luminous tide. It was not an invasion, it was an unveiling. In the vision, people all over the world stopped what they were doing at the same moment, not because of fear or disaster, but because something inside them, some old, half-forgotten chord, had finally been struck in perfect resonance from outside. Some fell to their knees in joy, recognizing in an instant the face they had loved from afar their whole lives, the voice they had tried to follow even when they stumbled. Others turned away, not because they had never heard, but because the light exposed too much too quickly, and their eyes, long adjusted to dimness, could not yet stand such radiance. The rapture the being impressed upon him would not be a magic trick or a cruel lottery. It would be a revealing of what had always been true, that those whose hearts were already leaning toward that light, even in doubt and imperfection, would find themselves drawn up into it like sparks carried by a holy wind. It was less about escape from the world and more about being gathered into the one who had been quietly knitting heaven and earth back together all along, through every act of mercy, every whispered apology, every tired prayer spoken into a dark room where no one else was listening. Daniel felt both terror and longing as he watched, recognizing himself somewhere between the ones who ran toward the light and the ones who hesitated, caught between shame and desire. And he wondered with a pang that cut deeper than any physical wound, where he would stand when that horizon finally arrived. The being's presence wrapped around that question like a hand around a fragile cup, steadying it, and over everything came an assurance that was not casual or cheap, but solid, costly, forged in some furnace he could not imagine. There was still time. Not time in the sense humans meant when they postponed change, but time as a gift, a window of mercy in which hearts could be softened, eyes could adjust, and those who had turned away out of hurt more than hatred could find their way back to the light they had once trusted. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the vision faded, the images dissolving into the soft glow of the being standing in his field, the humming still thrumming through the ground, the stars still absent above. In their place, higher up than his eyes could see, he sensed something watching, not with suspicion but with a deep, aching love, like a parent gazing through a window at a child who had wandered from home but was now finally, hesitantly, reaching back toward the porch. It was in that suspended, fragile moment between terror and wonder, doubt and surrender, that Daniel realized his life would never return to the quiet, predictable track it had followed before this night, and that realization terrified him even as it lit a small, stubborn flame of gratitude somewhere beneath his sternum. He did not know it yet, but this encounter would not only shake the foundations of his own soul, it would ripple through his community, through the people who thought themselves too ordinary for miracles, too practical for visions, too rural to be noticed by the cosmos, drawing them into a story where dusty roads and country churches found themselves woven into a revelation as vast as the galaxies. And as you listened to the unfolding of what happened next, you might find echoes of your own questions in his, your own quiet, unspoken prayers in the spaces between his thoughts, and maybe, just maybe, you will sense that this story is not merely being told to you, but is, in some small, mysterious way, reaching for you, inviting you into a community of souls scattered across fields and freeways and living rooms who have all, in their own way, felt the brush of something holy in the dark. From that first night forward, time no longer moved in straight lines for Daniel. It bent around that field, folding his past and future into the memory of standing before a being made of light and feeling the name of Jesus vibrate through his bones like a long-forgotten song returning with unbearable clarity. The next morning, the world pretended nothing had happened, as if the sky had simply reset itself while he slept, scattering the stars back into their proper places and smoothing the wrinkles of reality so that tractors still rumbled, coffee still steamed, and the local radio still crackled with farm reports and weather updates, indifferent to the fact that the universe had just bent down and looked directly at one of its smallest suns. The hum in the earth was gone when he stepped out onto the porch, replaced by the familiar crunch of gravel and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. And for a fleeting, almost merciful second, he considered the possibility that it had all been a dream, woven from grief and late-night coffee. But the air still held a faint, impossible sweetness, like the ghost of rain in a sky that had not yet darkened, and the edges of everything, the fence posts, the barn roof, the veins on the back of his own hands, seemed outlined with a subtle, shimmering clarity that made the world look both more real and somehow thinner, as if it were just a sheet of paper pressed over something far more substantial. He moved through his chores mechanically, feeding cattle, checking water lines, tightening bolts on a stubborn piece of equipment, each familiar action both grounding and surreal, because for the first time in his life he felt as though he were only half inside his own days, like a man walking through a dream while fully awake. Every ordinary noise sounded strange to him now. The clank of metal, the lowing of cows, the rustle of dry husks in the wind, all of it seemed to ride on top of a deeper silence, an invisible current he could no longer ignore, as if beneath the obvious world another world was thrumming, waiting for people like him to finally admit they heard it. He tried to tell himself that nothing had changed, that what he had seen could be filed away somewhere in his mind, alongside the unexplainable things people sometimes experienced and then politely buried under the demands of breakfast and bills and broken machinery. Yet each time he attempted to push it down, the memory rose again, not as a scene, but as a feeling. The sense of being known and welcomed by something that had reached through the fabric of the night to touch him without breaking him. By mid-morning, the tension inside him had grown so taut that even the smallest thing might have snapped it, and when his neighbor, Tom Walker, pulled into the driveway in his battered pickup, raising a plume of dust that glowed in the angled light, Daniel felt a surge of almost panicked protectiveness over what had happened, like a man standing guard over a fragile, glowing ember in his chest. Tom climbed out of the truck with his usual easy gait, a man who had spent his whole life in the same county and wore that rootedness like an old jacket, and he waved a gloved hand as he approached, his breath fogging in the cool air. Conversation came in the language of weather and work. Rain chances, corn prices, a rumor about a machinery auction 3 towns over. And Daniel found himself nodding and answering on autopilot, his mouth forming words while his thoughts stood back, watching the distance between this surface talk and the previous night's revelation stretch like an impossible gulf. 3 times he almost mentioned it, a strange light, a noise, something odd in the field, but each time the words jammed in his throat, blocked by the image of Tom's face twisting into skepticism or pity, the way people looked at someone who had been out alone too long and come back with stories that didn't fit the acceptable categories of rural sanity. Tom eventually left, offering a casual wave and a promise to bring over a tool he'd borrowed months ago, and as his taillights disappeared down the gravel road, Daniel stood in the yard alone again, feeling the thickness of unspoken truth pressing against his ribs. He lasted 3 days like that. 3 long, trembling days in which the memory of the being in the field followed him like a second shadow, always just at the edge of his vision, ready to flood his awareness if he let his guard down for even a moment. At night, he returned to the porch, cup in hand, eyes locked on the place where the column of light had touched the earth, half hoping and half dreading that it would return, torn between the desire to prove to himself he wasn't losing his mind and the instinctive fear that no human frame was built to endure such encounters more than once. Each night the sky remained faithful to its old routines, the stars flickering, the moon dragging its quiet arc overhead, and nothing happened. No hum, no shifting constellations, no towering presence of light, only the long cold hours and the whisper of his own breathing. It was on the 4th night, when sleep had become a stranger and his soul felt scraped raw, that the second sign came, not in the sky, but in his own home, in the room he had avoided more than any other. The house was dark, lit only by the thin orange glow from the wood stove in the living room, and he was standing in the hallway staring at the door to what used to be Claire's sewing room, a place he had left mostly untouched, frozen in the amber of grief. Something about the encounter in the field had stirred a reckless courage in him, a sense that if the universe could bend low enough to press a hand against his shoulder, then maybe he could survive opening a door. He had kept shut for too long. His fingers trembled on the knob as he turned it, the familiar creak of the hinges sounding louder than it should have in the still house. And as he stepped into the room, the scent of her, diminished but still present in threads and old fabric and the faintest trace of her perfume, rose up like a ghost, meeting him halfway. He stood there for a long time, letting the ache wash over him, not fighting it for once, letting the memories of her voice, her laugh, the way she hummed hymns under her breath while working, flow through him until his chest hurt, in that strangely clean way pain sometimes does when it is finally given permission to exist. Then his eyes fell on the Bible on the small table by the window, the one she had read every morning with a cup of tea, its pages feathered and soft from years of turning, and an inexplicable urge rose in him, quiet but insistent. Open it. He almost resisted, out of habit more than defiance, but something about the tone of that inner nudge felt different now, braided with the same resonance he had felt standing before the being of light, and so he stepped forward, picked up the book, and let it fall open where it would. The thin pages parted near the back, settling on a passage he had heard in sermons and funerals and late-night radio programs, but had never truly allowed into the tender center of his own fear. Words about a shout, a voice like a trumpet, the dead rising, the living caught up together in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air. His first reaction was a bitter, reflexive one. He had heard too many arguments about that passage, too many charts and timelines and heated debates that treated it like a puzzle to be solved instead of a promise whispered to frightened hearts. But tonight, in the dim hush of the sewing room, the words did not come dressed in controversy. They came with the same hushed authority he had felt in the field, as if someone were leaning over his shoulder from beyond the veil, saying, "This is what you were shown, not in theory but in seed form." His pulse quickened as he ran his finger under the lines, the ink blurred in places where Claire's tears had once fallen, and a strange thought came to him, one that seemed to arrive from outside his own logic. What if that night in the field had been a kind of rehearsal, not of the moment itself, but of the way hearts might be awakened to it? The being of light had not come to terrify him into belief, had not rattled off doctrine or demanded allegiance. It had simply shown him a horizon and let him feel the pull of the tide building toward it. Sitting there with the Bible open on his knees, the memory of those gathering lights washed over him again, the sense of an approaching unveiling that was less about escape and more about homecoming. And for the first time since Claire died, Daniel found himself whispering not out of obligation, but out of raw, uncloaked need. He did not form polished prayers. What came out was closer to a groan, a handful of simple words threadbare with use and yet suddenly brand new on his tongue. "I don't understand, but I don't want to miss you." There was no immediate response, no voice in the room, no shaking walls, but something subtle shifted in the air, as if the space itself had exhaled, and a warmth spread slowly through his chest, gentle and firm, like someone had placed a steady hand over his heart from the inside. It was in that moment, more than in the dazzling vision in the field, that the true miracle began. Because what changed first was not the sky or the soil, but the tiny, stubborn posture of a single man's soul, tilting ever so slightly away from numb resignation and toward a person he had kept at arm's length out of pain. The days that followed unfolded like an odd blend of the ordinary and the quietly supernatural, the way a familiar melody sounds when someone adds a new harmony line beneath it. He still fixed engines, hauled feed, and washed grease from his hands at the sink while the sun slid down behind the trees. But beneath each action, there was now a low, steady awareness that he was not alone in any of it. that every bolt turned and every fence mended took place under a gaze that was not distant or disinterested. Small things began to happen, so gentle and easily dismissed that a less shaken man might have ignored them. A part he had spent hours searching for turned up in the first drawer he opened after muttering a weary, half-hearted, "Lord, I could use some help here." A cow that had been limping for days walked cleanly one morning after he laid a reluctant, embarrassed hand on its flank and whispered the simplest healing request he could manage. A neighbor he barely knew showed up with a hot meal on a night when his loneliness felt so sharp it almost made him sick. None of these events glowed with the obvious stamp of the supernatural if listed on paper, but inside them, woven into their timing and tenderness, he sensed the same quiet presence he had felt when the Bible opened to that passage, the same unforced kindness that had stood in his field, dressed in light. The second direct encounter did not come until weeks later, by which time his skepticism had not vanished so much as it had been tamed, like a guard dog that still barked but no longer bit as quickly. It was a cold, clear night, the kind that sharpened sound and made stars look like holes punched through black velvet, and he was driving his old truck down a long stretch of highway between towns, delivering a used tractor part to a man who paid cash on pickup. The radio dial had slipped between stations, leaving only a faint wash of static and distant voices struggling to reach him. And in that drifting noise, he thought for a fleeting moment, he heard something like a low, familiar tone threaded through the crackle, a resonance that brushed the back of his mind and made his hands tighten slightly on the wheel. The highway was nearly empty, just his. Headlights slicing through the dark and the occasional reflector post, winking past like the slow ticks of some enormous clock. And as mile after mile fell away beneath his tires, he felt that now familiar hum building, not in the earth, but in his own chest. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that something was drawing near again, not as an interruption this time, but as a continuation. A teacher returning to a student, not to overwhelm him with new information, but to deepen what had already been shown ahead. The sky seemed to thicken, the stars blurring slightly around a particular patch of darkness that grew denser as he approached, and his truck's engine, which had been groaning along with all the stubbornness of old machinery, suddenly quieted into an unnervingly smooth purr, as if soothed by an invisible hand. The world narrowed to a corridor of light framed by shadow, the stripe on the highway glowing faintly under his headlights, as though painted with something more than reflective. Paint, and in that corridor the sense of being watched returned, not by predators or authorities, but by something ancient and intimately invested in his next few heartbeats. Then, without warning, every gauge on the dashboard flickered and fell to zero. The headlight stayed on, but the engine cut out, and his truck rolled to a slow, inevitable stop in the middle of the empty road. Fear flashed through him in a quick, sharp burst. Memories of horror stories, of strange lights and missing time, and people who swore they'd been taken and changed in ways no one believed. But that fear was immediately met by a wave of calm that did not come from him, a stillness that settled over the cab like a soft, heavy blanket, and brought with it the unmistakable sense of the same presence he had met in the field outside. The air had changed. It felt thicker, charged with a subtle, tingling electricity that made the hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stand up. And as he stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on the frosted gravel at the road's shoulder, he realized that the sounds of the night had once again been gently hushed. This time, there was no dramatic column of light descending in the distance. Instead, the sky above him rippled, as if a veil had been drawn back just a few inches, exposing a sliver of brilliance that leaked through in the form of a broad, soft glow spreading across the clouds. From that glow, a single figure descended, not falling, not flying in the way he understood flight, but simply decreasing in distance, the way a reflection on water seems to draw nearer when the surface is disturbed. The being's form was the same as before, and yet somehow gentler now, as if it had tuned itself to the frequency of his growing trust. Its height was less imposing, its light slightly muted around the edges, not because its power had diminished, but because it had learned the contours of his fear and refused to trample them when its luminous gaze turned toward him. The resonance in his chest leapt in recognition, like a tuning fork struck and responding to the exact pitch it had been crafted for, thoughts rose again between them, unspoken yet as clear as if they had been carved into the air. You have begun to hear. The impression carried no flattery, no grand statement about chosen ones or special roles. It was more like a simple observation, the way one might remark that dawn had begun to color the horizon. Along with those words came an image of his own. Daily life over the past weeks, his rough hands resting awkwardly on the head of a sick animal, his voice cracking as he tried to sing an old hymn alone in the kitchen, his quiet pauses before meals growing a little less automatic and a little more honest. Each of these moments, the being seemed to indicate, had been responses, however small, to a call that had been echoing long before the night of the first encounter, a call not just to him, but to countless hearts scattered across fields and highways and cramped apartments and lonely offices. Again, the name of Jesus moved between them, not as a sharp dividing line, but as a person-shaped bridge, the one who had traversed every distance between the human and the holy, and now extended that same crossing into places people would never think to look, into the realms of physics and stars, and the fabric of space-time itself. This time, the being pressed further into a revelation Daniel had only glimpsed before, showing him that what he and so many others called aliens were often simply misunderstood messengers, created intelligences moving along highways of light. He had no instruments to measure, bearing witness to realities humans had been singing about in old hymns long before telescopes ever tasted the sky. It did not deny that there were deceivers, entities aligned with rebellion and darkness, twisting wonder into fear and curiosity into idolatry. But it made clear in a way that sent a shiver down his spine that its own allegiance ran like a bright, unwavering line straight back to the Lamb who had been slain before the foundation of the world. In the mental vision that unfolded, he saw a hierarchy unlike any organizational chart humans had drawn. A vast, ordered host of beings, some blazing like stars, some as subtle as whispers, each carrying out tasks in the great project of restoring creation, all of them oriented toward the same central figure, the same wounded and risen king. The one standing before him was not the highest, not the origin of all things, but it was unmistakably part of that luminous order, a servant whose glory lay not in being worshipped, but in correctly pointing worship away from itself and toward the one whose name had once seemed to him like empty syllables and now felt like the axis on which everything turned. Daniel felt small in that cosmic perspective, but it was not the crushing smallness of insignificance. It was the humbling smallness of realizing he had been invited, along with all other human beings, into a story that stretched far beyond his own lifespan, and yet had room for every tear he had ever shed. The being then turned his attention outward, beyond his own life, and he saw in cascading glimpses the fabric of rural America, the truck stops glowing at midnight, the solitary farmhouses, the tiny churches with peeling paint and flickering neon crosses, the pockets of men and women who had been told in 1,000 subtle ways that their lives were too simple, too small, too backward to be of any consequence to the grand march of history. But in the being's perspective, those places shone with a quiet intensity, like embers in a fire others had declared dead, their prayers and whispered names for God, rising like smoke into a sky far more attentive than they dared believe. The approaching horizon of the rapture, the unveiling he had seen before, touched these places with special tenderness in the vision. He saw hardened farmers whose hands shook when they folded them at night, truckers who listened to late-night sermons in the cab of their rigs while driving through deserts and mountains, mechanics who kept worn Bibles in tool chests, pages marked with grease, all of them feeling, without knowing why, that something was changing in the air. The being made it clear that this story was not being told to frighten them into hiding or to puff them up with notions of secret knowledge, but to invite them into readiness, not the frantic, anxious preparation of hoarding supplies and drawing battle lines, but the quiet, steady preparation of hearts, learning to recognize the voice of their shepherd, even in unfamiliar frequencies. As this understanding settled into him, another image formed, this time of his own town, the faces he knew so well. Tom at his kitchen table, his wife bowing her head, the weary cashier at the hardware store leaning on the counter between customers, the pastor of the little church, alone in his office, hands clasped. Over a sermon he feared no one truly heard. He saw himself among them, not as a prophet or a leader, but as a man who had been given the chance to live differently, to let the revelation he had received seep into the way he looked at people, the way he listened, the way he loved, until his very presence in their lives became a kind of quiet signpost pointing beyond himself, the being impressed upon him that the greatest evidence of what he had witnessed would not be in the retelling of luminous encounters or cosmic visions, but in the slow, steady transformation of his ordinary days, a softening of his temper, a rekindling of compassion, a new willingness to forgive slights he once held onto like proof of some invisible debt. That realization cut deeply, because it meant the response being asked of him was not glamorous or dramatic. It asked for something far harder than a single night of courage. It asked for a lifetime of surrender, one small decision at a time, in barns and diners and lonely trucks on dark highways. Yet in the presence of that radiant messenger, such a life no longer felt like a duty. It felt like joining a current that had already been flowing long before him and would continue long after him. A current that moved with the steady, unstoppable pull of nail-scarred hands drawing all things toward redemption. The being's light brightened briefly, not to blind him, but to mark a turning point, and within that brightness Daniel sensed one more truth. Perhaps the most destabilizing of all, this encounter, as personal and intimate as it felt, was not just about him or his town or even his country. It was one thread in a vast tapestry of awakenings happening all over the world. People in cities and villages, in jungles and suburbs, on mountaintops and in prison cells, were being gently nudged awake in their own ways, through dreams, through sudden convictions, through coincidences that defied the odds, and yes, through encounters with beings from realms they had been taught to dismiss as fantasy or fear. All of it was coordinated, not in the cold precision of a machine, but in the living, breathing wisdom of a God who knew exactly how to speak to each heart in the language it could best receive. Whether that language was a sunrise, a scripture verse, a line in a song, or the appearance of a luminous messenger in a field or on a highway, when the being finally began to withdraw, its form rising slowly back into the broad glow overhead, Daniel felt a pang of loss sharper than he expected, like watching a loved one board a train, and he surprised himself by taking a half step forward, as if to call it back. The resonance in his chest answered that movement with a gentle counterpull, a reminder that he was not being abandoned but entrusted, that the presence he craved was no longer confined to a singular point of light in the sky, but had seeded itself into the soil of his daily life, into the community he belonged to, into the very expectation with which he would now look at each new day. The truck's engine coughed back to life as if on cue, the gauges flickering up to their proper levels, and the night sounds slowly returned, tentative at first, then bolder, as though the world had held its breath and was just now remembering how to exhale. He climbed back into the cab, hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, but rather than the familiar, gnawing loneliness that so often accompanied him on these late drives, he felt a steadying, companionable silence filling the space, an awareness that the one to whom the messenger had pointed rode with him, unseen and yet profoundly present. In the months that followed, the changes that took root in him were subtle but unmistakable to those who watched closely. He laughed more easily, not because life had become less hard, but because hope no longer felt like a foreign country he had lost his passport to. He found himself lingering in conversations, asking real questions instead, of hiding behind jokes, and when neighbors shared their own quiet aches, the failing health of a parent, a child drifting from faith, a marriage stretched thin by unspoken resentments, he felt nudges to do more than nod and offer generic assurances. He began, hesitantly at first and then with growing simplicity, to offer to pray right then and there, not in long, eloquent speeches, but in a few honest sentences, inviting the same presence that had met him in the field and on the highway to step into. These ordinary aching spaces. Sometimes nothing visibly changed. The problems remained, the tears still fell, But in the midst of those moments, he would sense that same quiet warmth descend, wrapping around the room, the truck cab, the kitchen table, in a way that made shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, and breaths release just a little deeper. Other times, small miracles budded, pain easing unexpectedly, reconciliations beginning with a hesitant phone call, a teenager who had sworn off church, showing up in the back row one Sunday, eyes guarded but present, and while he never tried to claim credit or build some grand narrative about himself around these things, he could not ignore the pattern. Something had shifted in the unseen, and his life, as plain and rural and unremarkable as it might appear from the outside, had become a thin place where heaven and earth brushed against each other, often enough to leave a faint, shining residue. He did not turn into a preacher or a prophet. He kept his overalls and his worn ball cap, his calloused hands, and his tendency to fall asleep in his chair after long days. But the axis of his inner world had changed direction, tilting toward a coming day he no longer dreaded, as the end of everything but yearned for, as the moment when all these scattered signs, these quiet visitations, would be gathered up and revealed for what they truly were. Early notes in a song that would one day break over the whole world, like a chorus. Sometimes, on especially clear nights, he would still step out onto the porch with a mug in his hand and look up, scanning the familiar constellations, and for just a heartbeat he would feel again that subtle hum, that sense of a veil trembling. In those moments, he liked to imagine others doing the same, farmers in other states, truckers pulled over on lonely stretches of highway, mechanics locking up their shops in small towns, all of them pausing, feeling something they could not quite articulate, and wondering if perhaps they were not as alone as they had always assumed. Maybe you, hearing this, know something of that feeling, that strange tug inside when the wind stills and the stars seem to lean a little closer, when your usual certainties loosen just enough for a question to slide in sideways. What if the stories were truer than anyone dared to admit? What if the universe is not a cold, indifferent machine, but a cathedral singing with voices you have only just begun to notice? And what if your small, ordinary life, your long drives, your quiet kitchen, your late-night doubts, is already being gently woven into a much larger revelation? Perhaps you have had your own flicker of something unexplainable, a dream that felt more real than waking, a narrow escape that left you oddly convinced someone had been watching, a sudden warmth in your chest when you whispered a name you weren't sure you believed in anymore. Maybe you have never seen a pillar of light in a field or a luminous figure on a deserted road, but you have felt in the marrow of your being that there is more to this story than bills and headlines and the slow erosion of hope. If that is you, then in some quiet, mysterious way, you are already part of this community of souls scattered across farmlands and freeways, deserts and forests and little towns with one gas station and a single stoplight. All of you listening, however faintly, for a voice that once chose fishermen and shepherds and carpenters and would not hesitate, now to lean close to truckers and farmers and mechanics. Perhaps the real question is not whether these things are true in some abstract, provable sense, but whether you are willing to let the possibility of their truth reach past your defenses and touch the tender place in you that still hopes for a love large enough to explain both the stars and your own aching heart. Because if there is anything this story of a simple man and his encounters with a gentle, otherworldly messenger suggests, it is this. The sky may be vast and the distances between stars unfathomable, but the distance between the heart of God and your own chest is thinner than a breath. Maybe heaven has never really been above us in the way we pictured as children. Maybe it has always been the light that appears when we stop running long enough to feel it, the presence that steps into our ordinary nights and whispers through strangers, through scripture, through dreams, through beings of light and moments of unbearable honesty. And whether you choose to call this tale truth or fiction, vision or imagination, it still leaves you standing in that same quiet field of decision, the hum beneath your feet, the stars watching, and something in you leaning, however slightly, toward the possibility that you, too, are being gently, patiently invited home, truth or fiction. Maybe not even the teller of the tale could say for certain. Here, stories are woven not to trap you in certainty, but to reach for that place in you that can still feel wonder, to brush against your questions with gentle hands, and remind you that you are not crazy for sensing that something more is moving beneath the surface of your life. The truly magical, the truly sacred, often hides in plain sight, walking beside you down empty roads and sitting with you in the cab of your truck, waiting not for your proof, but for your permission to be felt.